Today, we're diving into a really fascinating and, let's be honest, pretty provocative idea. What if an ancient religious archetype could actually be a lens for understanding modern state power? The sources we're looking at today make exactly that argument. So, let's unpack it.
Well, the answer might be a lot more than you think. We do this all the time in politics. We use these old stories as a kind of shorthand to make sense of what's happening right now. We'll call an underdog story a David versus Goliath battle, or we'll warn against a Trojan horse policy. And these aren't just clever phrases, right? They are archetypes. They come loaded with a whole set of moral and political meanings, and they act like shortcuts to help us understand really complex situations.
So our sources zoom in on one really powerful archetype, the figure of Pharaoh, or Pharaoh from the Qur'an. And the core argument they make is this: the Qur'an presents Pharaoh less as one specific guy in history and more as a timeless political syndrome. You can think of it as a recurring pattern of behavior that defines absolute arrogant power, the kind of power that truly believes it's beyond any and all accountability.
So what does this Pharaonic syndrome actually look like in practice? Well, the sources kind of break it down into a playbook for tyranny. Step 1, divine self-assertion. This is the idea that the state's power isn't just political, it's sacred, it's unquestionable. Then you've got the classic move, divide and rule. You break society into pieces, into factions, to weaken any chance of a unified opposition. And finally, you securitize dissent. This is where any voice of criticism, any call for justice, gets framed not as a legitimate disagreement, but as a dangerous existential threat to the whole system.
And this quote, right here, direct from the Qur'an, "I am your Lord Most High." This is what the sources point to as the ultimate expression of that hubris. It's that moment where political authority completely merges itself with a divine mandate, basically placing itself above any moral or legal criticism. That fusion of absolute power with a claim to absolute righteousness, that is the crucial point.
Okay, so now the analysis gets very, very specific. And I want to be super clear here. What follows is a neutral presentation of how our source materials apply this archetype as an analytical lens for modern political Zionism. Our goal isn't to endorse this view, but simply to explain the argument exactly as it's presented in the sources. So the sources draw these direct parallels. For divide and rule, they point to the political and physical fragmentation of Palestinian populations. For sacralized power, they cite things like the rhetoric of being the most moral army, or making territorial arguments based on divine right. Demographic anxiety is linked to public discourse about a so-called demographic threat. And suppression of dissent is mapped onto the practice of branding human rights groups as fundamental threats to national security.
The analysis then identifies the specific modern tools they say are used to enact this playbook. They point to legal frameworks like Israel's 2018 nation-state law, which they argue creates different tiers of citizenship. They look at narrative control, for instance, the use of archaeology to legitimize modern land claims. They highlight the architecture of control. We're talking walls, checkpoints, permit systems, and they analyze securitization, where a state of emergency and exceptional security measures become the normal, default way of governing.
But this is where the analysis takes a really interesting turn. After laying out this whole powerful analogy, the sources start to critically examine its own dangers and its own limitations. Because as they acknowledge, using an archetype that is this loaded, well, you're basically playing with fire. And this gets to the absolute core of the tension here. On one hand, the Pharaoh archetype can be a really useful tool. It can help us recognize patterns of power and control that pop up over and over again through history. But on the other hand, it carries this massive ethical hazard. Such a powerful label risks becoming a tool for just demonizing the other side, for oversimplifying a really complex reality, and for basically shutting down any chance of a nuanced conversation.
Let's break those risks down a bit. First, there's dehistorization. That's when you lose the unique, specific context of what's happening on the ground because you're too busy trying to fit it into an ancient template. Then there's demonization, which is just reducing complex people and political groups to one-dimensional villains. You also risk conflation, dangerously blurring the lines between a state's policy, a religion, and an entire ethnicity. And finally, the sources warn that this kind of analogy can produce way more rhetorical heat than analytic light, meaning it generates a lot of strong emotion instead of creating deeper understanding. So, after looking at the argument and then the critique of that argument, let's just zoom out for a second. What this entire analysis really shows us is the incredible, persistent power of stories. I mean, whether we realize it or not, these ancient scripts are still running in the background of our minds, shaping how we see the world today.
There's a quote from one of the sources that really captures what some people call the Red Sea principle that's embedded in this whole narrative. The ultimate lesson of the story is that systems built on pure hubris and oppression, they might look powerful, they might even look invincible, but they are inherently unstable. They actually contain the seeds of their own undoing.
And all of this leaves us with one final, crucial question. It's the challenge that all of our source materials are really posing today. When we use these powerful, ancient stories to make sense of our world, when do they serve as a clarifying lens, helping us see patterns we might have otherwise missed? And when do they become a cage, trapping our understanding in simplistic, black and white thinking, and preventing us from seeing the complex, messy, human reality that's right in front of us? That's really something to think about. Thanks for joining me.